Good evening and most welcome to Heidegger 879. Today we are sort of continuing, but at the same time not, the previous lecture about how presencing happens. We are actually going to deliver a fourth option, an indication of why we need to be, or we already always been, engaged in what is happening, so to speak. Affordance is, what I want to say, presencing, that is world plus I, one could say, but they are not dividable in the presencing. You could say that I and the world is a random division. And that's one of the reasons Heidegger used Dasein. It's not me at all. Dasein is rather the tendency. And to be absolutely clear, this is our 9:20, and to be absolutely clear, it could actually be that Dasein goes outside myself. So put equation between Dasein and me, or a person or a subject, is absolutely out of bounds. They don't equate at all. And it's the same with the world, as I see here. So presencing is a much better word. And the lecture today is named Hearing and Seeing as Signature, or how we, so to speak, sign the world. And when I say sign, it's the active process of actually signing. For instance, my own name, I used to do like this when I was younger. And if I was supposed to be witness to a contract or a loan, I was a loan shark when I was young for a while, because I really liked it, not so much for the money, but I really liked to fill in forms. And I always signed them, and the other person had to contra-sign it. Two people signing, the land giver and the land taker. And this is actually quite similar. By hearing something, we sign what somebody is saying. And by seeing something, an object in the world, as shape in the world, you can say, or as mostly in the text, in the autobiography, it's reading, that is the signature. But it can also go for a painting. That was something I was thinking. Today's, at least since the mid-19th century, it's very common to sign a painting. And that is a sign of authenticity, but it's also other thing that has to do with finished is a second thing. And a third thing is that the painter and the painting gets some weird connection. Rembrandt, for instance, very seldom signed his paintings. It's a fad that came later, but it's very interesting. This is a co-signature of the whole world. And you can also say, by hearing, sensing, feeling, perceiving, tasting, we put our stamp on reality. And this is the very signature that is needed to affirm that something has happened. This is rather similar to the old question in quantum mechanics. That was actually a question before. But if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to sign it, has it fallen? It was a question that was later answered, one of those few philosophical questions that actually got a proper answer. And the answer is most definitely no. If the tree falls in the woods and there is no sign of it, not a single trait that it has fallen, nothing reached me, it has not fallen. there is another side to this. That is very seldom the case, but that's a different thing. I could say the most basic take on this very thing is the collapse of the superposition. What happens in the laboratory when you do quantum mechanics? Maybe you see some sort of superposition, or you don't see it actually. You don't see it until you look at it, and at the same time as you observe it, it will be signed, and that's a definite signature, because by observing it you make the world. It's a co-creation. And I've been dwelling, I've been looking a little bit more in Ian McCallister's latest book, The Matter with Things, and there are very big indications that this used to be the case long before. And in the Hopi Indian culture, in Indian culture proper, from the Indian subcontinent, creation is always part of reality. You create reality yourself. And I think that was the case also before the pre-Socratic tendencies of division between object and subject. I gather this is the more natural state for things to exist. Actually, in quantum mechanics, this is the only way the world can come into existence. This is the making of the world. This is actually the how of existence, the ontological question. It seems that science itself has taken a great leap from the ontic question to the ontological question. No longer do we ask what exists, we ask how does it exist. One way of expressing this is to say that consciousness itself, or presencing, has the largest role to play in ontology. Without consciousness and perception, there will be no reality at all. A very good way to deconstruct the bystander role is to take a more keen look at how experience spring into existence or perception. And if we examine very carefully, we notice it's a doing from the side of the observer. I mentioned yesterday when we had a relaxed conversation in front of some very nice pieces of Swedish flatbread, that there are more neurons going to the eyes and coming from the eyes. That is very important. The whole idea of perception to be of an outer world has been overturned in neurology. And one of the reasons is, of course, it didn't work at all to have a representational model of the world. One could say it was discovered that we had some bias or predetermined ideas we were not aware of, and that's the most important, because things we're not aware of have played such a huge role in all directions of knowledge, bar none. No one has been free of this influence, because it's not an influence in ordinary sense. This is coming from pure experience, without ideas, without you even having a language. It's pre-language, it's pre-ontological, it's pre-everything. So it is a thing to be actually quite interested in looking into, but it's very hard at the same time. But we know now that just a millisecond before we have perception, there is a big nothing around us, so to speak. We have what usually is called empty space. An empty space is the perceptual space before perception. And that is actually, in my eyes, or in my ears, or in my hearing, or whatever, that is very similar to the superposition, because it becomes decided in the moment of hearing, seeing, sensing, perceiving, not before. And this is how it used to be even in Western world, and it's still the case in China, Japan. We say there, they say there, that the world is a co-construct. We become God. And when you ask this question, is that not blasphemous? Don't you put yourself in the same position as God himself? Isn't that problematic? For instance, if we're going to bring this question up to Pater Thomas or Breivik, as it was called, I think he would object and say, how can you say that? You put yourself above God. Well, there's a few things I can say about that. This was no doubt, no question, the case by the Old Testament before Hellenization took place. That is the original Judaic Hebraic religion. That was also the point of Robert Magliola. It's pre-Hellenized, pure Judaism did not have the idea that you didn't create the world. The passive tendency came from Western thinking. So it is a new thing, so to speak. And I wouldn't go that far as Robert Magliola, but he would say that it's not even part of Christianity. It's a strange element. And it's actually unique to Christianity and Islam. Doesn't exist in other religions. And of course that makes it suspicious. The second thing is, and this is also a point I heard before, that makes God impossible. For reality takes place when we are co-created. All reality, in all cultures, at all time, bar our very own Hellenized perception. And since God should be a part of the ontological structure, a real thing, so to speak, that's completely impossible if you don't have an active participation. From superposition we learn all real things needs your active perception, observance or hearing. All real and perceived books or text needs that you read it actively from your point of view, from your own standpoint, not the standpoint of the conformity I or the ego, the thing we are accustomed to read something in Western culture. That thing actually nullifies the text. It turns it into polarities of good and bad, important and unimportant. That's a polarity that I'm suffering for myself. When I read a text, I usually think to myself, that is not important. And then I turn the page and then I think, that is important. That destroys the text. You need to read the text with your own mind. Of course you can say some things are more interesting than other things, but to heavily make a preemptive division, that's the nullification of the text. That's why big works like Shakespeare, the Bible for instance, all those are disappeared from our intellectual arena. They're no longer goods for us. And we do things that even a rather simple computer from the late 90s could have done, making polarities between man and woman, upper class, lower class. That was the most popular in the late 90s. I remember an essay we would make, a B essay in sociology, made by a computer, and we made as an input and also an algorithm to adjust different positions, polarities, man and woman, upper class, down class, and we added all these buzzwords that were popular at that time. Discourse was very popular, text was very popular, gender related and so forth. It was like filled with all this, and it got a G, which is like godkänt. It didn't get a VG, but hey, I don't know what would happen today with more modern computers. It will probably get a VG because it could have done all that language correction and tedious repetitions, because I saw that already when it popped up to the computer. But that is easily adjusted. Polarities are incredibly easy. And there is nothing easier than a criticism, just turning somebody's argument upside down. A child can do that, and that is what a child does when he's or she is 5-6 years old. She just say no to everything. That is what academia is today, and this is what Derrida tried to mend. I love that word, Derrida on the mend. There is another thing there. There is some indication that affordances that Gibson mentioned. Gibson was the great pioneer in science of cognition and neurology. And he thought it was ludicrous on an intuitive path to talk about things in the world, because when I think about things and when I arrange my thinking, I constantly do it with what I use. Things I don't use have a completely different role in my thinking, in my brain, or what I do. So when I pass this table to go out to the kitchen or to the toilet, those are the things I plan. Those are the things I perceive. I perceive things that has something to do with me. Otherwise, perception doesn't make any sense at all. It's a little bit like the idea just going into the world and observe it like this without a purpose. This is what representationalism is. And of course, maybe today, because of what the tide has flown and what happened, it sounds completely ludicrous. But this was the standard method only 2 decades ago. Everything was representationalism. It was even the case in the science of literature, in philosophy to some extent even, and it was absolutely ludicrous at that time as well. It makes human beings passive observers of their own reality, non-thinking, just receiver of the reality, almost like receiving orders from the state in 1984. Tomorrow you do this and that, on Friday you get married, next week you have a child, Saturday you become an astronaut and you fly to Saturn, and so forth and so forth. So it is a structure that also have this oppressive tendencies if you let them be, but Derrida never said that was the most important, and it's not. The most important is freedom, the freedom of thought and freedom of having knowledge, or the interest maybe, because this is sort of a double. We ourselves are the ones who think we are not participating, because it can never be the case really that we are not constructing our own reality, because there are no exceptions to the collapse of the superposition. Everything gets signed. So what on earth is Heidegger, Derrida, what's the article about autobiography then about? Because we always sign. Well, that is a tough question, and I'm really sorry I asked it, because now I had to answer it. It's a tough one. I thought about it keenly just before here, 1 hour. I will try to give two speculative answers to that. The first one, it could be a matter of degree. If we are participating, and of course we are participating, we are doing it reluctantly or maybe unconsciously. And we can actually be ruled by unconscious habits, or yeah, I think the better thing to put that into words is we are hiding away the process of collapsing the superposition or signing things to a level that is out of reach for control, for direction, and it's beneath the surface, and it becomes sort of a noise, brus, as you say in Swedish, and it's beneath there. And what deconstruction does in this first my first tentative explanation, is to sort of opening up this bus and see, this is how I decided the text, and then I realized that was sort of crude. There was more polarities than interesting differences. And well, as we all know, putting everything in just two categories is very crude. It's like going into a fantastic museum of art and say half of these paintings are bad and the other one are good. That is an injustice both to the bad paintings. I would say it's even greater injustice to the good paintings, because each painting has its individual flavors, its individual differences. And it's a very coarse way, and it's so biased. It's a person who is like really squared. I met such persons, and they're usually not really interested in art, but some are, and they just pass the painting and said good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, and they're out of the museum in half an hour, down in the museum bar to having a drink. Actually happened to me once. I wasn't the one sitting in the bar of the Van Gogh Museum. And do you know what the rascal told me? This is not the Van Gogh bar. This is Få en grogg bar. But despite that, the only fun he had was that joke. He could have enjoyed the whole museum, and he didn't even bother to go to Rijksmuseum. So creation of reality makes reality something for us. That's the second take I have. Reality without participation becomes a bland, distant, sort of abstract flavored world without real coloring, without real action. It becomes meek, bland. It doesn't really matter to us. It's like one of those alienation movies where you're not really participating and everything is black and grey or something of that sort. There is no inclination, really. There's some inclination, there are some wants, but those wants are on a lower level. It's like you crave it. It's more automatic. Also in this take, it's a matter of degree, of finesse. But every deconstruction I went into some book, it adds to the book more finesse, more detail, more nuance. It adds depth. My experience become deepened, widened, broadened, but also the very book becomes something I can share with others while talking about it. But on the other hand, on the other scale, the conformist scale, when everything is polarities, it's very hard to share that because it's more Well, it's more about like this guy from Grog Museum. He divides everything in very crude categories, and those categories are not shared by anyone because they are random, more or less. You don't have time to judge where the painting is good or bad, and you don't, I think this is a good point, you don't develop the skill either. If you're too quick to decide if something is good or bad, you never develop the skill. And Derrida and deconstruction, and also Nagarjuna, is all about skilled appreciation, skilled perception, skilled experience. And that is always on a scale. Here in the West, we universalize everything. We think everyone is on the same scale somehow. And that could be another reason why we made knowledge so bland, so distant, because everybody can repeat it. And as was this paper in sociology, it wasn't really about anything. It was just the polarities. And in a way, that is incredibly much easy to learn. And that means that everybody could pass the exam. And this is what happened the last 20 to 30 years. It becomes much easier. And that will also heighten the perception it is all the same information somehow, because everybody could repeat it. Well, do they have any depth to it? Well, that is one of those things that Derrida doubts, because there is so much superficial reading of everything. Sloppy, uncareful reading. And sloppy, uncareful reading is polarities, or a degree of polarities. Nota bene, this is a late night reminder. This doesn't mean that polarities shouldn't exist. That's another thing. Polarities do exist, but they exist when we are present and we really recognize them for what they are. For instance, I'm good at mushrooms. There is no scale on deadly poisonous mushrooms. There is a great polarity there. There are actually 4 that you should avoid. That is really clear. So it's not a generalized idea, and it's not that simple as it's made in the state of Washington in USA, which is the worst case. Oregon and Washington has developed Derridian differentialism and Foucaultian differentialism into a simplified game of reversal, which is stupendous. I think I mentioned the college Greenboro, I think it's close to Portland somewhere, where they kidnapped the headmaster, put him on a chair, and everything he said was either biased, racist, sexist, I don't know what it was. And he wasn't even allowed to use his hands, because if he used his hands, that was an authoritarian trait. It could be. But that's such an oversimplification. It's deconstruction on a stupendous level. And of course I get a bit miffed when I hear Jordan Peterson, just because this university and some other ones especially in northwestern states, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, that are the worst. But that doesn't mean that they have understood what Derridian differentialism is, or deconstruction. It's the same thing. You couldn't say that for instance, Hitler understood Nietzsche well. There is a connection, and they use Übermensch, but nobody seriously think that he is using it in the same way. It's a cruder way, and actually it's so crude it doesn't bear much resemblance from the other thing.
Yes, you mentioned yesterday informally that eyes have more active neurons than passive neurons.
Yeah, going out to the eye, yeah.
So three active neurons, 3 more active neurons. But how is it with the ears? What does modern neurolinguistics say about the
I,
ears?
I have to check that out, but I would take a guess it's the same thing. What I know though, that hearing is very important for balance. And balance is something that is sent out to the system. Why is that? Is not balance a sort of perception? No, not really. It's something internal. You balance up. And hearing sort of helps. So the free balancing organs, they are all internal. They're not external at all. But they get help from the ears, and that help is coming from the internal situation. But it wouldn't surprise me that there are more neurons going out to the ears than in. It makes sense. I think that is the case of all the senses, except possibly with the exception of tasting with the tongue, not with the nose. But I can check it out. It's actually the working, I mentioned this before, and I don't know if you remember this. I think this could actually be helpful. It's a nice friend of ours. I don't know if you remember him. He looks like this, maybe. He's a unicellular creature.
Yes, what was the name?
We call him Alan the amoeba.
Amoeba, yes.
And what does the amoeba do? Well, what we would say from a human perspective or Western language, we would say, one, moves. Two, it tastes. Three, eats. This is sort of an original creature. It's more primitive than us, but it could be said in an evolutionary manner, it's our ancestor. For us, these are three different things. But how is it for Alan the amoeba? Is the different things for Alan the amoeba? To move, to taste and to eat is exactly the same for the amoeba. There's no difference at all. And since this is a predecessor to us, it makes sense it's the same thing for us. Action, perception, digestion, feeding, defecating even. And this makes a lot of sense to see our system. Language, and especially Western language and Western thinking tradition has divided these. But there are many languages where there is no division like that, where they don't have adjectives that we do. Remember this, we can get fooled with language, or there could be traps in language, but you don't have to fall into them. They're not necessary. I'm not that sort. I'm not a Sapir-Whorf person. I'm in between. So I say language can have a possible effect. It's a possibility. It could be actually the majority. But it's not a necessity. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, those were the ones that got me interested in Hopi language from the beginning, Navajo. They say that language absolutely determines how your reality is. I would say they suggest very strongly, like the mirror, yeah, it's a good example, like the mirror, language suggests very strongly. And if you don't have adjectives, it will be really hard to distinguish these features. And you instead have this, I wouldn't call them verbs actually, because how could something be a verb when you don't have object, subject, or adjectives? It's a compound way of talking, maybe you could say, but it's not a compound because it has always been that way. It's never been things put together into new words. So our language tricks us. But oddly enough, Sanskrit actually has adjectives. So that could have tricked the people of the Indian tradition. But as you might remember, and this was long before we started to record these lectures, we were talking about the five jhanas and the five vishigata. And there was taste, hearing, smell, and so forth. And they see it, and this is not even one thing that belongs to only one of the philosophies, religions of India or Eastern Asia. It seemed to be like a general conception that's the case. Everything is being built up by hearing, seeing, smelling, talking, and so forth. And they are really into that, as you like in the beginning, it was a sound or a word. They do really take care of their own language. Copy text meticulously since 3,000 years ago. That's just beyond belief. And I wish I had the skill to get my interest into that. That could be some knowledge to really ponder about. So I think another take on this, a fourth take, could be like see how we build up the world with our senses. And all these things sort of affirm, sign the outer world. Because even to Alan the amoeba, there is some world. He has, or she has, or it has some sort of very crude world. There's no doubt about that. And it's ludicrous today to talk about reality being inside the head. Nobody says that anymore in neurology. They say it in all other strands of knowledge, I know that. But I think in this case it's actually neurology we should listen to. A little bit, if there is a traffic accident somewhere, should we listen to neighbor B or neighbor C? Or what do you think?
To the VT police.
Yes, exactly. we should listen to the police. And neurology in this case is specialized in these things. And if they say it is like that, I think we have to trust them. And even on top of that, they discovered that we have a bias we had no idea about. I think that's even better. That's more deeming, because no philosopher, no thinker pointed this out, bar Heidegger and Derrida. Maybe Merleau-Ponty, maybe, but he's like after. Affordances is very interesting, because that was start of the term. And the interesting thing in neurology and the science of cognition that follows suit shortly thereafter, it actually started with a combination of intellectuality and practice. It happened at the same time. So Gibson was the first who dared to take the step. And then practice evolved very rapidly, thanks to the thinking. So that is also, it made me so happy to read about that. I think here we see thinking having effect, like it had in the Renaissance. And here also you can see that people are listening to the one who's thinking, for good reasons. It's not just talking into thin air anymore. It is decisive, it is respected. This is actually could be the new spring of intellectuality. This is what Chemiro, he hints in that direction, this deadening intellectual zombie-like way may be coming to an end, because it is created by bias we had no idea about. It's bad, but the good thing is those biases are not so hard to get rid of. Once you understand them, they just disappear. For me it was like that. Representationalism for me disappeared in a fortnight. I thought it really weird in the beginning, and it took me 2 weeks, And I am a very stubborn person. For me, it's not, those things don't come easily. So I think it could be a great relief, because I really felt afterwards that was a major error of thinking, no matter what. Even if I never had any interest in neurology or science, the science of cognition, it has been very helpful, and it will be helpful in every subject you encounter or whatever you do. So I think that's good enough for this time. I'll be happy to get back to this, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Sleep tight. Bye bye.
Thank you. Night.